Well, it was certainly not what the health minister was expecting, nor indeed what he wanted. And in terms of being helpful to the government, I don't really think that it's been of any particular benefit. Not surprising, though, that he and indeed Kerry Stokes, with significant interests in China, should be talking their book. They stand to suffer greatly by any breakdown in relationships or any further breakdown in relationships between Australia and China, and therefore, obviously, for their own commercial interests, want to make sure that things get back onto an even keel as soon as possible. But in the broader scope of things, Annalise, if I can say this, all this finger pointing that's going on, both on the part in particular of the United States and China in the midst of this, the greatest health emergency the world has seen since the plagues of yesteryear, what we really want is for these two superpowers with all their technological, scientific and other expertise to be working together so that all those things we don't know about the coronavirus and what needs to be done to try to beat this pestilence, that they bring all that they've got to bear together, instead of which what we're seeing now is finger-pointing, hostility and opportunism on the part of the Chinese in particular, but also on the part of the United States, which is of no benefit to the greater task of opening up the global economy again once we get over the worst of this coronavirus. The longer that this kind of backbiting, finger-pointing and so on goes on, the longer it will take things to return to anything like normality.
Michael Kroger, what do you make of that point? Is this finger pointing, or is this just finding some accountability for what's been the biggest economic crisis of our lifetimes, possibly since the Great Depression?
Yeah, well, as Mike Pompeo said, of course, you know, Australia and Macron and most normal governments around the world want to know where this has come from. You know, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. What are we just going to ignore it and say, oh, well, it was in the past, now we'll move on? No, of course there needs to be an investigation. You know, of course we know in the end it did come from China, and gets back to the point about Andrew Forrest. I mean, apart from all the other etiquette breaches and the sheer naivety of Andrew in relation to what he did at the press conference and bringing the Chinese official on, to say, Annalise, that the virus, we don't know where it started, it may well have started in Australia, is what, you know, Twiggy said, was absurd and laughable. And I can tell you from talking to very senior people in the government, he's irreparably damaged his, at least in the short term, his relationship with the government, who thinks this stuff is cuckoo. That for Andrew to say it may have originated in Australia. I mean, you know, defend China fine, but really this was very strange, and it's gone down incredibly badly, I can tell you that.
But don't you wonder, sorry, Annalise, don't you wonder, Michael, that yes, of course there needs to be an investigation into where this originated and how, but it's the context in which that occurs that is not helpful at the moment. And it would be better, would it not, for the rest of us, the globe, beyond the borders of China and the United States, were it the case that both sides try to work cooperatively rather than trying to find fault with each other.
Yeah, but
we're looking at a pandemic that was started out of China. This offer was hundreds of millions of dollars of tests that will be footed by the taxpayer. All Andrew Forrest did was organise this transaction for us. Is this not something where if China wanted to have a mutual cooperation and repair the relationship, they could be gifting us that?
Well, they could, but they wouldn't do that. No, look, the fundamental point here is this, that the Chinese government has spent billions and billions of dollars in the last 10 to 20 years in countries all around the world trying to buy credibility and domestic favour, and it has been working brilliantly. They're investing in countries like Zimbabwe and, you know, in the Pacific, everywhere. The Chinese tentacles are everywhere, and good on them. But what has happened now is this is a public relations humiliation, a disaster from which they will take decades and generations to recover. That's why the Chinese are so quick to try and denounce any suggestion that it really came from them, and to have people prominent in Australia say, oh, you know, we don't know that it came from China, it may well have come from Australia, is not only is it nutso stuff, but it helps the Chinese. You know, and I'm not sure, Jim, there's ever going to be a right time to investigate this. Are the Chinese ever going to want to admit through their incompetence it came from them, their lab or their markets or whatever in Wuhan? Of course they're not going to want to admit that, because that admits all sorts of terrible failures. So there's never going to be a right time to have this debate, quite frankly.
I couldn't agree. Look, I could not agree more. The question is, in terms of Australia as a middle power, in terms of trying to get up an inquiry on this issue, whether the manner in which the government went about it was the right way to have at least a prospect of achieving a result, rather than simply floating a balloon and hoping that something emerges from it. Quite clearly, at the moment at least, it hasn't produced the result that the government would have wanted.
Mm. And I'm not sure it's going to, Jim.
Can I ask you both about... No. Sorry, we are going to run out of time, so I wanted to cover off one more topic, and that's what's happening in the United States. It's just extraordinary. We've seen President Donald Trump say he's seen evidence that the pandemic did originate out of a lab in Wuhan. He hasn't shared that evidence with us, but it shows he is under pressure in the US, and we've seen people storming Michigan, their Congress, the state-level Congress, with weapons, protesting against these lockdown orders there. Michael Kroger, I mean, it starts to look a bit like storming the Reichstag.
It does a little bit, and I've got to say the interview that Trump did, where he was talking about injecting yourself with disinfectant, did him more damage than I think anything he said during the entirety of his presidency. These global problems which occur so rarely have to be treated with incredible sensitivity, which is why the Australian Prime Minister, Greg Hunt, Murphy and the Premiers, being politicians, have done a very good job in dealing with it and communicating what they've been doing. Trump, as a non-politician, has been having these 2-hour press conferences, freewheeling on all sorts of topics, and it's done him a lot of damage. So he's got ground to recover. He can still win the election, obviously, but going on to these press conferences without the caution and conservatism in language and communication that you've seen from Brendan Murphy and Greg Hunt and Scott has done him a lot of damage, and you can see that in his poll ratings.
Jim Middleton, what do you think this means for the future of the United States? Do you think we are going to start seeing an escalation in violence? Well,
it does seem quite possible, doesn't it? I hope it certainly does not, but the President, with some irresponsible comments at the beginning of those protests, didn't help matters at all. This is what happens, I think, when you end up with a social influencer as a president. That is, the all care, no responsibility, Michael and Annalise. And rather than observing the protocols, and very careful our Prime Minister has been in insisting that he's taking steps based on the best possible medical and scientific advice available. The President of the United States, the supposed leader of the free world, has been quite the opposite. As you say, the injecting yourself with bleach was probably the most irresponsible thing I've heard from a leader at any level of government anywhere in the world. And clearly some people believed him, because there was responses that were required by the medical authorities in the United States to deal with that. Measured, responsible, based on scientific evidence is the way to go. That it gives us the only hope, I think, of defeating this thing. There is so much we don't know about this. We don't even know what we don't know in some instance about the coronavirus. So the steps that people like Scott Morrison are taking are to be applauded. Those of President Trump are to be deplored. At the moment, it does appear, as Michael was saying, that his actions are starting to have an effect on his poll ratings. Doesn't mean he won't lose the election in November, but he's damaged himself very seriously, at least in the short term, as well as jeopardising the health of many millions of Americans as well.